Can you really have too many network tiers? By the end of this video, we will be able to describe 3-tier network designs. Okay, so the answer is yes. 3 tiers is about as much as we want in a network design, and in this video we want to explore what a 3-tier design looks like and what each tier is responsible for within the network. A quick note before we begin. If you're working your way through the Encore playlist, then you've already seen the skill, Explain the Hierarchical Network Model. However, if you haven't yet seen that skill, then be sure to go check that out before moving forward with enterprise network design, because we need to understand the basics of the hierarchical network model in order to understand these design philosophies. So within that hierarchical model discussion, we talked about how we have network blocks. And just like building blocks, when you think about a toddler or a kindergartner building with blocks, we can interchange these blocks and move them around and add new blocks, etc. with relative ease, because this is intended to be a modular network design. And the way we make this modular is we put a core layer right there in the middle that interconnects every other block. Because if we think about it, otherwise we have, let's say, 5 blocks here. We'd have to have a whole mesh design between all of the blocks, and that would get really messy really fast. Instead, we leverage a hub and spoke design where the hub here is the core and the spokes are the individual blocks that connect to the core. Well, the nature of this core is what defines a 3-tier design. If we're going to leverage a 3-tier design, we need a dedicated core layer, because the core layer is going to serve as the first tier, and then we can connect down. Let's say we're connecting to a distribution block, a pair of switches that are running layer 3 services back to the core, and that would be the second tier. The third tier would be the access block. This is where our end devices connect into the network, so we think laptops, PCs, phones, for example. Everything is going to connect in at that access layer, and that would be our third tier. Now, the primary advantage to the 3-tier architecture is the scalability of it. Again, we talked about how we can continue to add modular blocks all the way around the network. For example, if we have multiple buildings and multiple distribution layers, I might bring other buildings with their own distribution layers into the network core. And maybe I have a lot of these distribution layers, a lot of buildings coming into the core. Each one represents the path of a 3-tier design, because we have core distribution and then of course an access block that's going to hang off of that distribution layer. Even in the data center, for example, the data center has a pair of distribution switches. Although in the data center, the funny thing is we use a different word for it. We call them aggregation switches. It means the same thing. We just like to say a different word than distribution, because distribution typically means a campus building where users attach. So an aggregation layer is going to have its own data center access layer hanging off of it. And so we still get that 3-tier architecture moving into the data center space. So as we draw this architecturally out, at the core layer we're going to have a pair of switches. These switches will connect to each other at layer 3. And then when we get down to multiple distribution layers, each distribution layer is going to have its own pair of switches. These 2 switches will be connected at layer 2 to one another, typically speaking. And by the way, later on in the skill, we're going to talk about extending layer 3 down to the access layer, and that would change this connection to layer 3. But for most deployments, this will be a layer 2 connection, and then we extend layer 2 down to the access layer switches, regardless of how many there are, usually out in network closets. So these connections will come in redundantly to the 2 distribution switches. We have our layer 3 SVIs or VLAN interfaces here on the distribution layer, serving as the default gateway for all of our clients that are connecting in at the access layer. And then we have layer 3 connections back to the core, ideally in a full mesh configuration like what's drawn here, and these will also be layer 3 connections. Meanwhile, if we have another building, the second distribution layer, we're going to mimic this design. We have 2 distribution switches connected to each other, again, usually at layer 2, and we're going to full mesh the connectivity between this distribution layer and the core switches. And then this building's access layer switches would have redundant connection to these distribution switches. So we can see how scalable this architecture is, because the core here is the first of our 3 tiers, is going to connect to every other distribution block in the network. So the biggest benefit to this design is going to be scalability. Because as mentioned, we can have as many of these distribution blocks as we want in the network. However, there is a downside to the 3-tier design, and that is simply the cost. Because having dedicated core switches, and these are usually not cheap switches, having those in the network does come at a cost. In fact, having separate distribution and access switches can come at a cost. And so for smaller networks where we don't need the scalability necessarily, it might not make sense to have a dedicated core layer. And that's what we're going to explore in the next video when we talk about a 2-tier network design. So when do we need a true core layer? Well, believe it or not, it's a little bit subjective. I mean, if we have a network where we have two distribution blocks, we can connect those together and no problem. Maybe we have the internet block hanging off of one of those distribution layers. You know, I mean, this is not a terrible network design. It's for a smaller network. It works great. However, what if we get another distribution layer in here, like a third building on the campus or what have you? Well, now we have to start full meshing these connections or otherwise risk redundancy, right? Because if this link goes down or the whole distribution layer on the left goes down, then we've isolated a layer. So instead what we want to do is full mesh these connections, and once we have too many, well, this is when a true core layer would come in handy. And so every network has to decide at what point that threshold is reached where we say, you know what, right here in the middle, we're going to deploy that true core layer and get that 3-tier design. And with that, you are now able to describe 3-tier network designs. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.